Silence permeated the house, clinging to the walls like lingering memories, pressing against everything from the furniture to the bookshelves. There were instances when she almost believed she could still perceive his footsteps reverberating in the hallway, his voice softly humming the melodies they once sang together. And the gentle creak of his chair as he occupied his place at the dinner table. Noah had been absent for 2 years, and while the external world had progressed, it felt as though time had stagnated within her modest abode. Her name was Olivia, a woman who had always taken pride in her resilience. However, following Noah's passing, that resilience felt like a fragile shell fracturing under the burden of solitude. She repeatedly reassured herself she believed that she would be all right, and that life would become easier. Nevertheless, it did not. The absence of his presence became a persistent ache in her chest, one she could not alleviate despite numerous distractions. Although she had been attending therapy sessions, they never seemed sufficient. The pain remained a quiet yet insistent companion that trailed her from room to room. She reflected on the old house they had constructed together, a dwelling that still bore every trace of him. The day the idea struck her felt serendipitous. A fleeting thought that lingered long enough to take root, a dog, she murmured to herself while standing in the living room, gazing out the window at the distant street. Perhaps that is what I need. She had never been particularly fond of animals, unlike Noah, but the loneliness had become unbearable, and perhaps a companion could alleviate the void left behind. That afternoon, she reached out to the shelter, and the days that followed were blurred as she visited the local animal shelter, pondering which dog could be a fitting companion. The expressions of each dog seemed to implore her silently, but it was only upon encountering Milo that she experienced an internal transformation. Milo was not the most aesthetically pleasing dog in the shelter. He was a mixed breed with unkempt shaggy fur and eyes that conveyed an intelligence incongruent with his scruffy appearance. When she first approached him, he did not respond. He did not immediately jump or wag his tail. Instead, he quietly regarded her with a tiny inclination of his head, as if assessing her. Then, unexpectedly, he softly nudged his nose against the bars of the cage, a nonverbal plea for her attention. Impulsively, Olivia extended her hand to him. He accompanied her home that afternoon. His paws scraping the floor as he wandered through the house, sniffing everything, marking his territory with the excitement of a new beginning. She followed him around as he explored every corner of her heart, ringing with an odd mix of excitement and apprehension. She was grateful for his presence and for the way he seemed to fill the house with life again. The first night Milo spent with her, she allowed him to sleep beside her. She had expected some discomfort and the awkwardness of sharing her bed with a creature she barely knew, but there was none of that. He curled up beside her, his head resting against her side. And for the first time in months, Olivia felt the stirrings of something resembling warmth seeping into her. The steady rise and fall of his breathing, like a lullaby. And she found herself closing her eyes, her body relaxing. For then, tender sound running to the sound of Milo's gentle snoring beside her, she forgot the ache in her heart. The hole that Noah had left behind, the years of grief that had weighed her down. Instead, there was just Milo lying beside her, a new companion in the strange, quiet world she had built for herself. Over the next few weeks, Milo became more than just a dog to her. He was her companion, her confidant, the one who stayed by her side when she could barely be alone. His presence was constant. Always there to provide comfort in the form of a wagging tail or a gentle nudge. Olivia found herself talking to him as if he could understand every word. As though he could somehow fill the emptiness in her heart that Noah had left behind. There were times when she would sit in the living room, reading a book or watching TV. And Milo would lay at her feet, his eyes never leaving her face. In those moments, Olivia couldn't help but think that maybe Noah was watching over them. And that he had sent Milo into her life to help her heal. One evening, after a particularly long day, Olivia found herself walking to the kitchen, Milo following closely behind. There, She poured herself a glass of wine. She turned back to the living room, surprised to see Milo sitting at her feet, his large brown eyes staring up at her. "I am uncertain what I would do in your absence," Milo murmured, scratching his ears absent-mindedly. Milo's tail thumped softly against the floor, and then stood still. Actually what she meant, as if he'd understood. Olivia smiled at him, her heart warming. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Little did she know. This quiet, unassuming dog was about to change everything for her. As the days went on, Olivia found herself more and more attached to Milo. She began to see him less as a dog and more as a companion. Even a confidant. At night, she allowed him to sleep beside her. The warmth of his body, a comfort that helped ease her loneliness. There were moments when, in the stillness of the night, Olivia would lie awake, her mind drifting to Noah and then to Milo. She would whisper his name softly, as though calling to Noah, and sometimes she thought she felt a response, a shift in the brush of warmth against her. She found herself thinking that maybe Milo wasn't just a dog. Maybe he was Noah returned in a new form, a new life. It was a fleeting thought, one she quickly dismissed. But the more time she spent with Milo, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that, somehow, some way, he was filling the empty space Noah had left behind. As Olivia sat on the couch one evening, Milo nestled near her, her hand softly placed on his head, she was unable to suppress a smile. This may have been what she had anticipated all along, the solace of companionship, the complicated pleasure of having someone beside her once more. Nevertheless, a faint voice in her mind began to murmur, cautioning her that circumstances were not as straightforward as they appeared. However, for the moment, Olivia dismissed the thought. Content to revel in the warmth of the present, with Milo beside her. Days merged into weeks, and Olivia's existence appeared to center on a straightforward, repetitive routine: awaken, walk Milo, feed him, release him into the yard, and subsequently spend the remainder of the day together. The mornings were tranquil, the silence palpable, dense, and suffocating. As if Olivia had acclimated to it. The silence in the home did not disturb her, not as much anymore. Milo's calm and consistent demeanor had introduced a degree of stability to the tumult of her emotions. Although there was an additional element that Olivia had not entirely comprehended until this moment, until now. Despite Milo becoming her buddy, she discovered herself depending on him in unforeseen ways. Well-being with Noah, but now it was primarily with Milo. She started to observe minor details, his unwavering gaze trailed her every movement, exuding a loyalty that rendered her the focal point of his existence. She was unaccustomed to such attention, yet it felt somehow reassuring. At night, when she entered bed, she sensed Milo nestling next to her, his warm form cuddling closely against her. What started as a way for him to feel secure and provide companionship for her, Olivia has now transformed into an unspoken ritual. She had consistently exercised caution in forming attachments, particularly to ephemeral entities. However, her bond with Milo developed so organically and subtly that she remained oblivious to its profundity until it irrevocably established itself. One evening, while Olivia sat on the couch engrossed in a book, Milo leaped beside her, as was his custom, and rested his head in her lap. She absent-mindedly caressed his fur, momentarily engrossed in her thoughts. The external world appeared remote and insignificant. She contemplated Noah, reflecting on the permanence of never hearing his voice again. The world had advanced during her absence, leaving her in a quiet home filled with memories. But here was Milo, as if his warmth could bridge the gap and fill the void. She quickly contemplated whether he could comprehend the profundity of her sorrow and perceive the vestiges of Noah's presence that still resided in the corners of the house. It was a transient notion that she promptly disregarded. Regarding Milo, it was merely a dog, or so she repeatedly assured herself. This shift was subtle at first, barely noticeable. It started with small, almost insignificant changes, Milo becoming more insistent in his desire to be close to her, his nudges and movements at night becoming more frequent and intentional. At first, Olivia didn't give it much thought, given that dogs are naturally affectionate, and Milo had always been a bit clingy. However, it wasn't until one night after she had returned home late from a meeting that she noticed his increased presence. She walked into the living room to find Milo sitting by the door, as though waiting for her. Although waiting for her, he greeted her with his usual wag of the tail. Instead, he just stared at her. Those dark eyes followed her every move. "Hey, Milo," she said, trying to break the tension she felt suddenly creeping up her spine. He didn't respond, but his gaze never left her. There was something different in the way he looked at her. Something that made her pause for a moment, her heart beating just a little faster. She chalked it up to her own weariness. Maybe she was just imagining things, but the feeling lingered, nagging at her just beyond the reach of her conscious mind. The next days were filled with more of the same. Milo was constantly by her side, almost too much so. She couldn't understand why he had become so insistent on being near her all the time. When she went to the kitchen to make a cup of tea, he would sit by the door, his eyes fixed on her. When she went to the bathroom, she would open the door to find him sitting on the other side, waiting. It wasn't that he was being overly demanding, but rather, it was the intensity of his attention that began to unsettle her. He seemed to be watching her in a way that was more than just a dog seeking attention. It felt as though he was waiting for something. Anticipating. One night, she awoke in the middle of the night to find Milo lying on the edge of the bed, his face inches away from her. His breath was soft against her skin, but his eyes were wide open, fixed on her. She blinked, confused. In a moment, he pressed his nose against her cheek, drawing nearer. "Milo," she murmured, her voice thick with slumber. "Still." The dog remained still and unresponsive. Instead, he lay there, his body pressed against hers in an almost protective manner. There was no discomfort or hesitation. He was simply present. Warm and solid, and Olivia found herself relaxing into the sensation. However, something lingered in the recesses of her mind. She was unaccustomed to this level of attention from anyone, especially not from a dog. In the following nights, the pattern persisted. Milo would climb into bed with her, curling up beside her, his body against hers in a manner that felt strangely intimate, as if he were asserting a claim over her space. Occasionally, in the middle of the night, Olivia would awaken to find him nudging her, as if attempting to draw closer. It was not an overtly sexual gesture, but it differed from the typical way a dog would snuggle. Initially, Olivia dismissed it. It was merely the dog showing affection. But the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her logical reasoning indicated that her loneliness and yearning for connection were causing her to overinterpret Milo's actions. Nonetheless, she instinctively sensed a shift occurring in their relationship. She struggled to articulate an inexplicable sensation and attempted to disregard the escalating tension. She could not afford to dwell on it, particularly given her dependence on Milo's companionship. She feared confronting the reality that her feelings for him might extend beyond mere affection into something more intricate. Nonetheless, the burgeoning intimacy between them was undeniable. Milo began to attune to her emotions in ways that felt almost sentient. When she was melancholic, he would remain close, resting his head on her lap, his eyes brimming with empathy. Conversely, when she laughed, he appeared invigorated, seemingly elated by her joy. In those instances, Olivia sensed a profound connection with him that surpassed the conventional pet-owner dynamic. However, one frigid evening in early winter, as Olivia sat by the fireplace, Milo approached her and nudged her hand, as was his custom. She absent-mindedly began to scratch behind his ears. He closed his eyes. leaning into her touch, but there was something different this time. He wasn't just seeking affection, he was waiting, as though he knew something was about to happen. As she leaned down to kiss the top of his head, she glimpsed something in his eyes, causing her heart to flutter momentarily. She believed she glimpsed something in his eyes, causing her heart to flutter momentarily. She thought she saw a glint of recognition, a flicker of understanding that seemed far beyond what she had ever expected from a dog. It sent a chill down her spine. Olivia had never considered herself the type to be dependent on anyone. She had built her life around independence, focusing on her career, her friendships, and managing her emotions in isolation. But since the day Milo had entered her life, something had shifted. Quiet moments that filled her day, once so lonely, were now peppered with the soft thuds of Milo's paws on the hardwood floors, the rhythmic panting as he sat by her feet. He wasn't just her companion anymore, he was her anchor. Each morning, as the sun began to peek through the curtains, Milo was there by her side, patiently waiting for her to stir. He didn't demand attention like some dogs, but his presence was undeniable in a quiet way. He would nudge her hand, he would gently place his head on her lap when she sat on the couch, providing her with a sense of comfort. But more than that, she began to realize how much she had come to rely on Milo's affection, especially in the absence of Noah. The house was quieter without Noah's laugh, without his presence in the kitchen. But Milo filled the void in a way that was almost too perfect. The way he followed her around, sitting in the corner of every room, always looking up at her with those big brown eyes, seemed to tell Olivia that he understood her pain. It was strange to think that a dog could understand something as complex as grief, but she couldn't shake the thought. Milo's gentle demeanor and calm nature were the balm to her wounded heart, and over time, she began to treat him less like a pet and more like a companion, someone who was always there. At night, Milo would curl up at the foot of her bed, his body warm and close to hers. Sometimes, when she awoke in the middle of the night, she would find him lying near her head, his breath soft against her ear, his eyes wide open as if watching over her. There was an intensity in his gaze that Olivia couldn't explain. He wasn't just a dog, she thought. He seemed to be something more, something that understood her in a way no one else could. Despite the growing attachment, there was an undercurrent of unease that Olivia couldn't quite pinpoint. It began to show itself in the little things, Milo's insistence on staying close to her at all times, even when she was doing something as simple as brushing her teeth or folding laundry. It wasn't that he was being overly needy, but the subtlety of his attention was starting to feel a little too much, a little too constant. One evening, as Olivia settled into bed, she glanced over at Milo, who was sitting by her nightstand, his eyes locked onto her. There was no tail wagging or playful barking, instead, Milo was simply staring at her, seemingly waiting for something. She murmured, however, the dog did not react. Rather, he moved closer to the bed and nestled next to her, resting his head on the pillow. Olivia paused, a shiver coursing down her spine. She was uncertain why, but something about this moment felt disconcerting. His proximity and his pursuit of her for solace seemed excessively intimate for a pet. Perhaps I am merely conjuring illusions, she said to herself, dismissing the disquieting sensation. Nevertheless, as she succumbed to slumber, Milo lingered by her, his warmth and unwavering presence. The days persisted in this manner. Milo remained consistently by her side, never distant. She endeavored to concentrate on alternative matters, her work, her social life, her hobbies, but Milo's presence was always there, like a shadow in her peripheral. She began to feel like she couldn't breathe without him. It was as though he had become a part of her, a fixture in her life that she could no longer imagine living without, and that in itself frightened her. It wasn't until a rainy evening, 2 weeks later, that Olivia began to realize just how deep the emotional bond had become. She had come home late from a work event, exhausted and drained, and when she entered her home, Milo was there, sitting at the door as if he had been waiting for her. His eyes were wide and expectant, but this time, there was something different in them, almost knowing. "Hey there, buddy." Olivia spoke softly, attempting to ignore the mounting tension within her. She crouched down to pet him, but Milo didn't immediately respond. He simply looked at her, his gaze unwavering. His body tense as if he were preparing for something. A shiver ran down Olivia's spine, but she shook it off. Milo had been exhibiting peculiar behavior recently, which she attributed to the weather-induced anxiety. Though she was uncertain if it was also a consequence of her newfound reading habit. She pondered whether his behavior was merely peculiar or if something genuinely unusual occurred. At night, while she lay in bed, Milo ascended beside her. She settled into his customary position at the foot of the bed, but this time, when Olivia extended her hand to scratch his ears, she noticed that he was becoming increasingly persistent. He was more persistent than usual, guiding her hand toward his face and exerting his body on hers with an intensity she had not expected. It was a peculiar feeling. As though he was insisting on her attention in an inexplicable manner. She attempted to dismiss it, convincing herself it was merely a dog expressing affection. Yet, the sensation of unease persisted. "Good night, Milo," Olivia murmured. Although the dog remained still, he remained supine, his body in contact with hers, as if anticipating her action. After several weeks, Olivia was unable to dispel the sense that something was amiss. Days elapsed, however. Olivia remained unable to dispel the escalating sense of disquiet that accompanied her whenever she was in proximity to Milo. It was not solely the manner in which he remained in close proximity to her, his body. Perpetually in contact with her, her consistently trailing her every movement, the nuanced alteration in his glance towards her, imbued with emotion, appeared to transcend the mere fondness a dog exhibits towards its master. It seemed as if he was attempting to convey a message, one that Olivia was uncertain she was prepared to receive. One evening, following another arduous day at work, Olivia entered her house to discover Milo seated at the door, awaiting her arrival. This time, there was no tail wagging or exuberant bark, instead. He remained silent and motionless, his gaze fixed on her. She had become accustomed to his attentiveness, however, this evening felt distinct. "Milo," Olivia remarked, her voice gentle yet tight. "What is troubling you?" Although she did not answer as she walked past him to hang her coat, she sensed his attention tracking her every movement. His stare was such that it elicited a chill along her spine. Milo abruptly approached, prodding her leg with his nose. She became immobile, her heart beating. She briefly perceived a glimmer of passion in his eyes, prompting her to retreat. The atmosphere between them felt electrified, as though an imperceptible boundary had crossed. But she was unable to articulate it. "Cease this, Milo," Olivia muttered, her voice quavering, yet Milo remained unresponsive. He instead advanced closer, rubbing his body against hers in an apparent search for solace. It appeared excessively close and peculiar. Olivia inhaled deeply, compelling herself to dispel the disquieting ideas. She was reluctant to acknowledge the reality of the bond she had inadvertently developed with Milo. "It's merely a dog," she reassured herself. Yet as she felt Milo's body press against hers once more, she couldn't help but question whether this was genuinely mere affection or if a more intricate dynamic was at work. The subsequent days were rife with tension. Olivia could not disregard Milo's behavior, which became increasingly evident through his nudges, persistent closeness, and tendency to seek her out in every area. He had always been needy, but this was different. It was as if he was attempting to convey a message beyond the capabilities of a canine. Olivia's thoughts accelerated. Was she engaging in excessive rumination? Was this only a dog's inherent desire for friendship, or was she beginning to perceive something deeper, something ominous? Something beyond her understanding? Every night, as Milo nestled near her, a sense of unease plagued her. She attempted to dismiss it, the focus shifted to other matters. Yet the tension between them was palpable. It transcended mere physical proximity, embodying an emotional burden. Milo seemed to occupy the void left by Noah, his gaze penetrating and comprehending. This intensity was becoming increasingly overwhelming for Olivia, who found it impossible to disregard. The tension had been escalating for weeks. Each day drawing closer to a confrontation Olivia feared she could not avert. The house, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a prison with Milo's suffocating presence and the relentless pressure of his gaze. His need for closeness and touch had evolved beyond mere affection into obsession. A truth Olivia had always subconsciously recognized. Although she anticipated this occurrence, now that it was tangible, she was uncertain how to extricate herself from it. That night, everything seemed to be approaching its peak. Olivia had spent the day at work, attempting to disregard the burden of Milo's presence in her life, believing that remaining occupied might alleviate the sensation of dread. However, the same intensity that had been building for days confronted her upon entering her home. Milo awaited her by the door, appearing initially as he always did, tail wagging as if nothing were amiss. Yet, as Olivia passed him to place her keys on the table, she discerned a notable difference. His posture was tense, his gaze fixed on her in a manner that rendered her vulnerable. There was a palpable sense of determination in his movements, accompanied by an urgency that had previously been absent. She endeavored to dismiss the thought from her mind. She reassured herself that she was merely being paranoid, however. The knot in her stomach conveyed an alternative narrative. She proceeded to the kitchen to clear her mind while Milo followed behind, his paws softly clicking against the floor, maintaining his unwavering focus. She attempted to dismiss it while he sat at her feet, gazing up at her. Despite the profound intensity of those gazes, the sensation of unease persisted. That night, as Olivia retired to bed, she sensed the familiar weight of Milo on the mattress. Initially, he had been content to rest at the foot of the bed, but now he remained perpetually close to her, his presence unwavering. She reclined in bed, gazing at the ceiling, attempting to soothe her thoughts. However, she sensed Milo's gaze upon her. Upon turning to him, she beheld him observing her. Unyielding, unblinking. It felt as though he awaited her initial gesture, anticipating her recognition of their connection. Olivia gulped, her respiration shallow. "Why are you regarding me in that manner, Milo?" she murmured into the stillness. But still, Milo remained unresponsive. He remained silent, merely observing without notice. Milo shifted. He slid across the bed until he was adjacent to her, his fur grazing her skin. Olivia's heart raced, his warmth and proximity made her feel utterly confined. She repelled him, yet he persisted. Milo's body was a heavy burden on hers, seemingly unable to release her. "Halt," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Despite the request to cease, Milo persisted. He prodded her again, his body exerting increased pressure against her side. She sensed the tautness in his muscles and the urgent compulsion in his movements. He was no longer merely pursuing solace. This was an entirely different sensation, one that was alien and caused her to feel as though she was relinquishing control over the realization that struck her like a lightning bolt. This transcended just affection, it had evolved into possessiveness and manipulation. It seemed ominous. She flinched. She distanced herself from Milo, pressing her back against the headboard in an attempt to reclaim her space, yet he pursued her. He was perpetually present, his body radiating warmth against hers, his breathing measured and intentional. He seemed to compel her to remain in proximity, ensuring she was as close as he required. Claw's eyes brimmed with tears as she recognized her inescapable situation. She had never experienced such helplessness. She wasn't just afraid of Milo, she was afraid of what she was becoming. Afraid of how she had let this bond grow so twisted. Her emotions, her thoughts, everything was clouded by the tension in the room, and now she could no longer ignore what was happening between them. Her mind raced, searching for a solution. She considered calling for help or fleeing the house, but she knew deep down that she couldn't. The connection between her and Milo had grown too strong. Too all-encompassing. It felt as though he could control her every thought, and she was powerless to stop him. "Why is this happening?" Olivia whispered, her voice breaking. She felt like she was drowning in the suffocating weight of the situation. As if on cue, Milo moved closer, pressing his head against her chest. His eyes closed for a brief moment, but then, just as suddenly, he opened them again, and Olivia felt his gaze like a silent command, a challenge. There was no turning back now. "Please," Olivia whispered, her voice desperate. Her hands trembling as they reached to push Milo away once more. But the dog didn't budge. He was stronger now, more insistent in his presence. Once comforting. It was now a force she could no longer control. She tried to reason with herself. She tried to convince herself that this was all just a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment. But deep inside, she knew the truth. This wasn't normal. This wasn't love. It was something far darker. As Olivia lay there, trapped in the warmth regarding Milo's physique, she pondered how this situation had transpired and how she had permitted it to escalate to this extent. The night lingered in suffocating silence. And Olivia realized that she had relinquished control over what was to come. The experience unfolded in a fog, with each minute becoming increasingly oppressive. Olivia's existence had devolved into a haze of bewilderment, loneliness, and apprehension. She attempted to resist, to distance herself from Milo, yet with each effort, he appeared to return with greater intensity. It was not merely that he trailed her incessantly, he was perpetually observing her. She attempted to contact a friend. She reassured herself that she might be overanalyzing the situation, but the more she contemplated it, the more she recognized that her perceptions were not just fabrications. Milo had transcended his identity as a mere dog. He had intricately intertwined himself with her existence to the extent that she could no longer discern the boundaries between herself and him. It was not merely affection, it was dominance. Obsession. She could no longer endure it. One evening, she positioned herself before the mirror, gazing at her reflection. Her eyes were vacant. Her complexion ashen. She had not been consuming food nor obtaining rest, and when she did sleep, it was often with Milo alongside her. She felt as though she was losing her identity. Subsuming into the backdrop of her own existence, merely an item for Milo to manipulate. "Why do you persist in not leaving me alone?" she murmured to her reflection but received no response. Only the gentle, persistent tapping of Milo's paws on the floor as he entered the room. As Milo approached her that night, Olivia had a chilling sensation along her spine. He had exhibited more emotional distance in recent days, yet tonight's atmosphere was distinct. His gaze met hers, and for an instant, Olivia sensed that he could perceive the essence of her innermost self. "Delighted," she said, her voice quivering, "just leave me alone." Yet Milo remained unresponsive. He merely sat in silence, fixating on her with an unblinking gaze. The hush in the room was overwhelming. Olivia withdrew to the room's furthest corner, her heart racing. She recognized that this situation was untenable and that she must flee, but how? Where might she proceed? She was unable to evade Milo, who was neither physically nor mentally absent in her life or spirit. When she exited the room, Milo trailed closely, his presence overshadowing her like a dark specter. Olivia's breath halted in her throat as she swiftly approached the door. She needed to escape, to liberate herself before it was too late. However, just as her fingers grasped the door handle, Milo sprang forward, obstructing her way. "Milo, desist. Olivia exclaimed, her voice faltering as she attempted to repel him. However, Milo proved to be more powerful than she had previously comprehended. His body crushed onto hers, his fur a heavy burden, and she could sense his breath on her skin. He was determined to retain her now and indefinitely. For the first time, Olivia comprehended that this situation transcended love, it had spiraled beyond control. The situation revolved around Milo's need for dominance and total possession of her, to which she had acquiesced. She had given him complete control over her existence. It was now too late to rectify the situation. With a final, desperate effort, Olivia successfully extricated herself from his grasp and exited the room. She continued sprinting until she reached the cool night air outside, striking her face. Yet, while she stood there, struggling for breath, she was acutely aware that Milo remained with her. Trailing her, observing her every action. That night, she was unable to sleep. Instead, she remained seated on the couch, contemplating an escape. However, every strategy she devised appeared futile. She lacked a confidant. Despite her desire to resist, Milo had transformed into her reality and her nightmare. The most troubling aspect was her uncertainty about wanting to escape. Deep within, a part of her still yearned for the closeness and connection that Milo provided, despite its suffocating nature. The following morning, Olivia awoke to an unsettling silence. Despite her lack of sleep, she felt inexplicably rejuvenated. The burdens of the preceding days had dissipated, although she was aware that this state would be temporary. Although Milo remained somewhere in the home, Olivia experienced an unprecedented sense of determination. She needed to conclude it. The atmosphere of the house had shifted. The house felt more desolate, as if an alteration had occurred in the atmosphere itself. Olivia recognized that she could no longer endure this existence. She had already experienced considerable hardship, and now she confronted the crucial question, what type of life was this? While she remained in the living room deliberating her next actions, Milo emerged at the door. His gaze locked onto her with a piercing intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. She remained unperturbed. This time, she merely gazed back at Milo. "It is over," Olivia declared, her voice resolute despite her quivering palms. "You can no longer exert influence over me." After a little quiet, Milo gradually advanced towards her. However, Olivia did not retreat. This time, she maintained her position, refusing to allow him to regain control. He immediately surrounded her, moving slowly and deliberately as if assessing her. And then abruptly, to her surprise, he stopped. It seemed as though he comprehended, for the first time in weeks. As Olivia experienced an unusual sensation of tranquility. Milo would no longer inflict harm upon her. He would cease to confine her. The power had transitioned, and for the first time, Olivia experienced liberation. But her freedom was not without cost. Olivia saw that she could no longer remain in this place, burdened by the recollections of past events and the persistent presence of Milo in her thoughts. She assembled a suitcase and departed. As Olivia exited her domicile, she recognized that her life would irrevocably change. However, for the first time in an extended period, she felt genuinely liberated. Unshackled from Milo and the stifling dominance he had previously exerted over her. As she departed, she pondered the lessons gleaned from her experiences. Love can be exquisite, yet perilous. The distinction between affection and obsession may become indistinct, often unnoticed, until it is too late. However, Olivia had unequivocally learned that she was now the arbiter of her own existence, and no one, not even Milo, could usurp that autonomy.